Let's talk about reliability and validity, two super important features for any research measurement tool. Reliability describes the ability of a measure to give consistent results when multiple measurements are taken. Meanwhile, validity describes the extent to which a measurement tool actually measures the construct or variable that it's supposed to measure and isn't affected by any kind of bias from any other variables. It's important to be able to analyze a measure and determine how reliable and valid it is, so we're going to do that next with two examples. First, we're going to learn about reliability and validity in the context of baking. If you've ever baked cake or cookies or something like that, or perhaps watched people bake in competitions on TV, you know that baking involves a series of complex chemical reactions that all have to be measured as correctly as possible in order to yield a properly delicious finished product. If you measure out the incorrect amount of ingredients, or put something in the oven for the wrong time or temperature, your baked goods can go from delicious to deflated pretty quickly. In this example, we'll evaluate the reliability and validity of different ways for measuring out the amount of flour to put into a batch of cookies. To compare these different measures, we'll look at them on a schematic graph of reliability and validity, with reliability on the x-axis and validity on the y-axis. Now, we'd like all of our measures of flour volume or anything else to be in the top right quadrant, because those are measures that are highly reliable, that are very consistent, and that are valid, that are correctly measuring the thing that we want with no bias from other variables. But sometimes we may have other measures that may be highly reliable, but invalid because they may be biased in some way, or sometimes we have measures that are valid that should be measuring the correct thing, but they're kind of noisy, so they won't always give us the same consistent result. So those would be valid, but slightly less reliable. And we really want to avoid measures in the bottom left quadrant that are neither reliable nor valid. So perhaps the most reliable and valid way to measure the amount of flour to put into a batch of cookies is to measure out the mass of the flour with a well-calibrated kitchen scale. It should be valid because the scale should be measuring exactly the mass of the flour and hopefully nothing else. And it should be reliable if the scale is well calibrated, that if we measure the same amount of flour every time, it should give us the same number. And you can see here that this kitchen scale measure can become less valid if, for example, we forget to tare out, that is zero out, the weight of our flour mixing bowl before we put it on the scale. Because then the scale is not measuring solely the weight of the flour, it is measuring the weight of the flour plus the mixing bowl, which is now no longer a valid measure of just the flour. So if we're not careful, valid measures can become invalid if we don't take out any known biases that could go into them. And for a measure that's probably about as valid, but perhaps a little bit less reliable, is measuring flour with a measuring cup. So a measuring cup can be reliable and valid if we level off the amount of flour in the cup every time that we scoop. But if sometimes the cup has a little bit more if the flour comes over the top, or a little bit less where the flour doesn't come all the way up to the rim, then now every time we scoop a cup of flour, it's not the exact same amount. That makes this measure less reliable. It's still fairly valid because we're always getting 1 cup plus or minus a little bit of flour, but the less careful we are, the more measurement error we inject into our measuring cup, the less reliable it becomes. So measures are less reliable when there's more measurement error for whatever reason. Sometimes this reason comes from the measure itself, and sometimes the reason comes from the person using the measure is not being as careful. And finally, purely pouring the flour straight from the bag into the mixing bowl without any kind of measuring device at all, I would say is neither reliable nor valid. It's unreliable because we have no real idea how much flour we're pouring in beyond just pure intuition, which is not very good. And it's not valid because it's so unreliable that we cannot even argue that it's even getting close to the correct number. Sometimes measures can be so unreliable that we have no way to know where the real number is, so we don't even know if they're valid. So to sum up, we have some measures that are both reliable and valid. These are the best ones. These measures can be less valid if the measurement device has some sort of bias in it. And they can be less reliable if, because of the measurement device or because of the user, there's some random error that gets introduced every time you use the device. And sometimes we have measures that are so unreliable that we don't even know what the right answer is, so those measures cannot be valid either. Now we can use our same graph of reliability and validity to examine some measures of a psychological variable. Let's say extroversion. Now, one reliable and valid way to measure extroversion could be your score on the extroversion part of a carefully designed personality questionnaire. Importantly, these questionnaires are pre-tested to make sure that they give consistent results over time for the same person, and that the results aren't picking up on any other personality traits. So they've already been checked to make sure that they are both reliable and valid. There should also be reliable and valid behavioral measures of extroversion. For example, if you went to a party, counting the number of people that any one person talks to at a party is probably fairly reliable and valid, but perhaps a little bit less so than the personality questionnaire. One reason to prefer a behavioral measure, like the number of people a participant talks to at a party, over a questionnaire measure, like a personality scale, is that sometimes questionnaire scores can be less valid if the person responding has a social desirability bias. That is, they want to give answers that they think will make them look good to the researchers. Then they're not responding about their own extroversion, they're responding about how extroverted they think they should be to be a good person. Behavioral measures are usually less sensitive to social desirability bias because it's harder for people to act nice in an everyday context than it is when they're filling out a questionnaire. But our party measure might still be less reliable if, say, some days someone is more tired, so they're not going to talk to as many people. Some days maybe they've just had a coffee, so they're really feeling kind of energized. Or our party measure may be less valid if we don't take into account, say, how many friends each participant has at that party, because we want to make sure that we're measuring extroversion and not just how many people they know at that party and would be willing to talk to. But not every behavioral measure is reliable and valid. For example, if we were to measure the number of parties that a participant went to in a given month, that might be an invalid measure if sometimes we are measuring people's party attendance during finals season. So in that case, party attendance is not actually tracking extroversion, it's also tracking academic motivation to study instead of going out. So this measure is now not valid because it is biased by another variable. And finally, an example of a measure of extroversion that's neither reliable nor valid might be one of those online quizzes that says, like, tell me all the foods you ate in the past 7 days and we'll tell you how extroverted you are. It's not reliable because if you eat different food over the course of the week, you're going to get a different score, and it's not valid because, come on, there is no way that the food that you eat in a week really translates to how extroverted you are. It is totally measuring food preference and not extroversion, so it's extremely, extremely biased. So now, using these examples, I hope that you will be able to compare the reliability and validity of measures of a particular variable.